Welcome to today's Explainer. So, we're kicking things off with a pretty intense question, one that really forces us to look hard at what actually happens when the very institutions built to protect us seemingly turn against us. What do you do when the scales of justice just feel fundamentally broken? It's a heavy concept for sure, but it definitely demands our attention. What does it really mean to be pushed entirely outside the boundaries of institutional protection? Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating framework known as geopolitical exile. We're going to be looking through the lens of Kyle McLean Smith's documented experiences, unpacking his specific allegations about systemic legal attrition by the Canadian Crown. And we'll break down the massive constitutional countermeasures he's building in response. It's a profound look at what it's like to be rendered a political refugee by the exact same state you live in.
To keep us on track, we'll follow this quick roadmap. 1. The modern outlaw concept. 2. Systemic legal attrition explained. 3. The property rights void. 4. The charter challenge strategy. And 5. Sparking systemic healing.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the modern outlaw concept, the case study of systemic alienation.
When you hear the word outlaw, you probably immediately picture, a criminal on the run, someone actively breaking society's rules. But this framework flips that definition completely upside down. In this context, a modern outlaw isn't a rebel at all. It's a citizen who has been rendered a political refugee within their own life, completely locked out of the justice system. Imagine the sheer defenselessness of that position. You're left entirely without a shield against the state, effectively turned into a subjugated outlier with absolutely no recourse.
Moving right along to Section 2, Systemic Legal Attrition Explained, Weaponizing the Courts.
200. Now let that number sink in for a second. According to the source material, that is the staggering number of lawyers the subject contacted and offered to pay without finding a single one willing to provide legal representation. This number acts as a terrifying metric of systemic exclusion. It just illustrates how impossible it can be to penetrate the legal shield when a citizen is isolated by the system itself. It's an overwhelming barrier to entry, to say the least. We all kind of grew up expecting ideal due process, a system fundamentally built to find the truth and make sure things are fair for everyone. It's the social contract we all rely on. But the reality experienced here is described as legal formalism. This is a weaponized, super rigid adherence to procedural rules used specifically to obscure the truth, completely drain a target's resources, and coerce outcomes rather than actually delivering justice. Kyle actually refers to this devastating machinery as the divorce industrial complex. The core allegation here is that this system isn't designed to resolve conflict at all, but rather to extract capital during a family's absolute most fragile moments. It actively weaponizes isolation, severely penalizing anyone who doesn't have a built-in safety net. He actually characterizes this entire bureaucratic process as operating essentially like domestic abuse, just scaled up by the state itself. It's a really stark warning about what happens when institutions prioritize extraction over actual human resolution.
Which brings us to Section 3. The property rights void, the root cause of vulnerability.
So how does this actually happen? Well, according to his framework, it all comes down to one massive gap: the complete lack of entrenched constitutional property rights in Canada. This isn't just some minor administrative oversight. The argument is that it's a massive constitutional loophole. It is literally the root cause that enables this geopolitical exile to happen in the first place, creating a structural vulnerability where someone's life's work and sovereignty can just be erased without any real constitutional protection.
Building on that exact void, he argues this lack of protection allows bad actors and the Crown to completely strip individuals of their assets. Families are allegedly torn apart specifically to extract their intellectual and financial wealth. He vividly describes the current legal environment as a house of mirrors, chaotic, highly subjective, and prone to breaking down into personality-driven rulings that leave everyday citizens completely subjugated without any true autonomy.
Let's pivot to Section 4, the charter challenge strategy, a strategic countermeasure.
So how in the world do you fight a system that massive? Well, the strategy proposed starts with a really fascinating game theory concept called a Schelling point. Overcoming this kind of systemic attrition means you have to establish a highly visible focal point. The idea is to create a moment or a movement so incredibly clear that society naturally rallies around it to demand fundamental civil rights, even without needing to directly communicate. Think of it like a crowd instinctively gathering around a single working street lamp during a citywide blackout. It naturally becomes a beacon for coordination.
And here is his exact roadmap for a charter challenge to create that beacon. Step 1 involves anchoring grievances deep in foundational history, pulling precedent straight from the Magna Carta and the 1869 Bill of Rights. Step 2 is securing a highly specialized legal team willing to take on the massive weight of the federal government. And Step 3 is launching that highly visible icebreaker case to force real, unavoidable accountability onto these state entities.
This is where the legal engineering gets really interesting. The strategy ambitiously tries to mash up two very different legal philosophies. You've got American textualist philosophy, which is all about strict, unyielding adherence to the text. And then you contrast that with the Canadian living tree doctrine, which allows laws to organically adapt over time. By blending the rigidity of textualism with the fluidity of the living tree, the ultimate goal is to permanently graft those missing, ironclad property rights directly into the nation's laws.
But this push doesn't stop at just the law. They are bringing deep tech into the mix to make sure this accountability is absolute. The aim is to eliminate human ambiguity by using deterministic technology and deploying Ricardian contracts, which are basically agreements formatted to be perfectly readable by both human lawyers and computer code. Throw in cryptographic hashes for verified compute, and you get a bedrock of absolute mathematical and legal accountability. No institutional house of mirrors could ever distort that.
Let's move to our final section, Section 5. Sparking systemic healing, from personal trauma to systemic reform.
If this ambitious charter challenge actually succeeds, the source argues it will trigger a massive societal shift. It would demand tangible accountability from institutions that currently just evade it. It would promote what's termed fifth-wave mutual personal accountability. It would completely stop the state from turning everyday citizens into alienated outlaws. And ultimately, it aims to restore the fundamental safety and integrity of the family unit. We're talking foundational resets here, not just minor legal tweaks.
Once we have the divorced industrial complex healed, everything else is a cakewalk. I mean, that single quote perfectly distills his entire macro-sociological theory. The fundamental belief is that how the state handles the dissolution of families is the actual root cause of much of our broader societal dysfunction. Fix that root dysfunction, ensure basic property and civil rights are ironclad, and the rest of society's sprawling issues will naturally just start to resolve themselves.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought for this explainer. What happens to a society when its institutions of justice alienate the very citizens they're meant to protect? It's a deeply challenging question about the incredibly fragile balance between state power, bureaucratic formalism, and our own fundamental civil rights. It definitely forces us to critically examine the legal frameworks we all live under and what happens when they fail. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the systems around you.